Hey guys, welcome back. This is going to be week 14 of the Automotive Weekly Waveform. And in this episode, we're going to be checking injector pulse in the fuel rail. Now, there's a couple ways we can do this, and there's some limitations to this test. There's two different tools we are going to use today. I'm going to use a pulse sensor. So if you guys have a pulse sensor, you can perform this test. We are also going to use a pressure transducer. I'm going to use the WPS500. And I want to talk about the difference between these two tools because they are drastically different, even though sometimes they seem the same. So a pulse sensor, this is the Nicholson pulse sensor. It has a piezo transducer inside of it. It does not have batteries. The piezo element in there, whenever I see a pressure pulse in this, like if I were to blow in it, it's going to move that diaphragm a little bit. It's going to generate its own electricity. Depending on how rapidly the pressure changes and how much the pressure changes, we're going to see different amounts of voltage. For this test, we're not going to see a big change in pressure. It's going to be very, very tiny. So this is still sensitive enough to pick that up, but we're going to be on a lower scale. We're probably going to be like at 200 millivolts or 100 millivolts. If I had this in the intake or exhaust, we may be at like a 5-volt scale or something like that. This can't tell me how much pressure I have in there. It's only going to represent a change in pressure, and it's not a value that I can measure to see how much change of pressure. So if you need to know exact amounts of pressure that you're dealing with, this is not the tool. But this does a lot of stuff just by showing you a change in pressure. The other thing to keep in mind is if I were to blow in this and apply, say, 1 psi of pressure, I'm going to see a spike in my waveform. And even if I keep blowing and holding that pressure in there, my spike isn't going to go up and stay there. It's going to go up and then it's going to drop down because as soon as that diaphragm quits moving, it stops generating power. So it's going to deflect up, it's going to generate some power, and then the voltage is going to drop back to zero, even though that diaphragm is held up. As soon as I release that pressure, it's going to move the other way. It's going to generate a negative voltage. So I'm going to get a little dip. So you typically see a oscillating pattern. It normally doesn't go up to an amount and stay there. If we use an absolute sensor or a pressure transducer, these require power. This one has a battery built in. These snap-on transducers plug into the top of the Zeus or the Virus, or you can buy a little 5-volt breakout box that works with the Triton and the Modus. I know some guys are building their own, and I believe ATS, the pressure transducers from them, are along the same lines. They're a 3-terminal transducer, and one of those terminals has to be power and ground in the other signal wire. So those all require power. I believe Brandon Dill at Jarhead Diagnostic is making some 5-volt breakout boxes for those type of pressure transducers. If you don't have a breakout box, but you have a transducer and you want to use it, check out his 5-volt breakout box. So this is going to allow us to see a pressure change and reference it to a 0 point. Very useful for in-cylinder pressure transducer testing, any type of actual pressure testing, whether it be oil pressure, coolant pressure, transmission pressure, hydraulic pressure. This is what you're going to want to use. The pulse sensor will not hold up to high amounts of pressure, and this guy will. This guy's rated up to 500 psi. For the guys across the pond, that's 34.5 bar is the maximum pressure of the WPS500. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the Nicholson pulse sensor. I'm going to hook this up to the vacuum line that is on the pressure regulator. On this Toyota behind me, that vacuum line does not connect to the intake manifold. Most vehicles, it connects to the intake manifold, and the change in intake vacuum changes the pressure on that diaphragm. And at idle, when you have high vacuum, it actually lowers the fuel pressure because you don't need as much fuel pressure to get the fuel to run out of the injector because the vacuum inside the intake is helping draw that fuel out of the injector. Now, Toyota doesn't use the vacuum system on there. They just changed their programming to say, hey, we don't need to deliver quite as much fuel at idle. So either way you do it, Toyota still runs the vacuum line to the air intake tube between the throttle body and the air box. There's no vacuum there, but if the diaphragm ruptures, the fuel can still get sucked into the engine rather than spill on the road or on the engine and cause a fire. But luckily for us, it's easy to get to. I'll just pull this vacuum line off. We're going to hook the pressure transducer up to that, and we're going to connect this to the vehicle. Now, if this is sitting on the vehicle and I'm hooked up to it, the vibration from the engine running is going to alter our readings. So a lot of guys will hang this from a bungee cord from the hood. I have a long enough hose which may reduce the, it may dampen my readings a little bit, but I can set it on my cart and I don't have to worry about those vibrations. Now, we also have to look and see where we're getting the best reading. Sometimes you get the best reading while cranking, sometimes you get the best reading while running. So we're gonna try both. If you're trying to do it while cranking, you can't use the normal clear flood method because that's gonna shut off the injectors. You don't wanna kill the fuel pump, so we will have to kill ignition for that test, which on the Toyota, that's really easy to do. I can kill ignition very easily. I cannot kill fuel very easily. So that is one benefit to running this test on the Toyota if we want to do the cranking test. Now, the other thing you have to watch out for is some vehicles while cranking, they're not firing the injectors sequentially, they're firing them as a batch. So they may fire one bank and then the other bank, or they may fire them all at once. So that may affect our readings. We may not get a good reading while cranking, but some of the other pulse sensor tests that we're going to do, which another test is on the same vehicle for week 15, we're going to want to do that in a cranking state. So I have this one. I need to hook up a synchronizing channel, and that is going to be, I'm going to try and hook up to injector number 1. Firing order on this engine is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it'll be easy for us to identify, where our other cylinders are. So I'm just looking for my back probes. Now, depending on what scope you're using, the injector voltage, the inductive kick, could be up to 100 volts. So snap-on, no problem. If you're using the Pico scope or the Autel or the U-scope, put the attenuator on. U-scope, you can't use 2 channels at once, so you're either going to be looking at just the pulse on the injector rail. That's the only thing you can look at because you only have 1 channel. And then you'll have to create a sync by maybe unplugging an injector. So I'm going to hook this up to injector number 1. The other lead, we're going to hook up to the Nicholson pulse sensor. Now, when I ordered this from Michael a couple of years ago, he asked me if I wanted the Banana Jacks or BNC. I said, can I get both? Because I don't know what scope I'm using it on. I don't know what test leads I have available. So I have both versions, or both options on this transducer. I'm going to move my cart a little bit over here so I can just lay that on there. We'll be careful not to disturb it too much. We'll get some of our settings set up here. Channel 2, we need to be up at 100 volts. Actually, since we're not really interested in what the injector waveform is specifically doing, we're just using it as a sync, I'm going to go 200. That's going to shrink that waveform. It'll take up a little less real estate on the screen. And then our pulse sensor, we'll start at 200 millivolts and see where that gets us. Now, I can see that I'm already above the 0 mark here. Not sure why, but it's okay. There's no change in pressure, so I'm not sure why it's showing voltage. It's probably one of my other leads or something. But we'll start up the vehicle and see what kind of waveform we get. Okay, I changed my settings a little bit and changed my channel configuration. I was getting a little bit of noise on the signal. I'm not sure how to check my cables, but I was getting some feedback from the injector pulse into the pressure transducer. I'm not sure why. So I flip-flopped my channels, changed my settings, my scaling a little bit, and got a capture. Let's go ahead and save this. Let's zoom out, and then zoom back in. Okay, so here we can see a complete cycle of the engine. So 720 degrees, we see the injector fire twice during that period, and we see several pulses here. So I'm just going to count the pulses, make sure I have 6 pulses, make sure that everything is reading properly. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so that all looks good. Now, this test isn't definitive on if all the injectors are flowing properly. This may indicate an injector that's not flowing at all or drastically reduced in flow. And we're going to notice that some cylinders might be higher or lower depending on the location of the regulator. Now, this regulator is located on the driver's side bank or the left bank of the engine all the way at the back, and it's all the way at the end of the fuel rail. So the fuel rail comes in bank 1 at the back, so it's going to feed 5, 3, 1. It's going to bridge over to the other side of the engine and then feed 2, 4, 6. So cylinder number 5 on the other side might have the lowest pulse, and cylinder number 6 on this side might have the highest pulse because it's closest to that pressure regulator. We can see that we are connected on cylinder number 1. Now, looking at the tops of these peaks, we notice that every other one is slightly lower than the other one on the return as that pressure comes back up. And we may be looking at this the wrong way because we're seeing the change in the regulator and it's being affected by the pressure change in the fuel system. It may be inverted, but you know, all in all, this looks fairly even. I see 3 that are lower than the other one on the rising pulse. On the falling pulse, it also looks like we have 3 that are a little bit less in amplitude there. Let me throw some cursors up so I can just have a spot to show you guys here. So this pulse is lower, this pulse is lower, this pulse is lower. But then if we look right before that, this pulse doesn't drop as far, this pulse doesn't drop as far, and this pulse doesn't drop as far. That's going to be a characteristic because we have the regulator all the way on the one side of the engine and it's farther away from those cylinders. So here we have cylinder number 1 firing, and we see a drop in pressure in that rail, and then the pressure returns back to normal. But since it didn't drop as far, it didn't have to return as far. That's why this upper pulse is not as high as the other ones. The next one is on bank 2, where the regulator's at. So we're going to see a bigger drop in pressure. This would be cylinder number 2. And then since we saw a bigger drop, it's going to return further. So we see a higher pulse there, so on and so forth. It looks like our drops for bank 1 and bank 2, all of the ones on bank 1 are about the same. All the ones for bank 2 are about the same. So maybe we should purposely kill an injector and see what happens. Or perhaps we should try cranking it, because sometimes you have a little bit too much noise. Let's try a cranking capture real quick. I haven't done it on this vehicle, so I'm not sure. And then we will disable a fuel injector and see what happens. So I'm just going to unplug the ignition igniter. This is going to kill my spark for all the cylinders. So I don't want to crank it for too long because we have the potential to flood out the engine. But at least this way I will still have injection pulse. I just won't have an ignition source to make the engine actually start. And this may be an inconclusive test. We may not see anything here. But I see some pulses. Let me zoom out a little bit. So for this test, it seemed like we were seeing a lot more ringing or oscillations in the waveform, but it does look like we can, or can we? I'm wondering if it's batch fire in these injectors for this, because we're not seeing 6 distinctive pulses between our 2 markers, or it's firing that injector on every rotation of the crank instead of every other one, like we were seeing before. So in this case, this test is inconclusive. I'm going to go ahead and re-enable ignition, and I'm going to kill 1 injector. So I'll probably move my trace over to cylinder number 3, unplug injector number 1, because I don't think I can unplug injector number 3 without tearing up my hands. I'm not going to save that capture because it was inconclusive. So now I am hooked onto cylinder number 3 injector. We have the ignition hooked back up. I have injector number 1 unplugged. So let's start it up and see if we see a difference in our waveform. Are we still going to see a slight pulse where that injector was supposed to be firing or not? Okay, so this one we are seeing some weird stuff happening. Now keep in mind we are synced up on cylinder number 3. So this is 3. We see that drop in pressure. 4, drop in pressure, 5, drop in pressure, 6, drop in pressure. Now it should be 1. Did I not count that up right? Oh, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. Now looking at this waveform, it almost seems like we're not getting the, our sync isn't in the right spot. Our firing order is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if our injector's on number 1 or 3 here, so this would be 3, this would be 4, 5, 6. This should be number 1, but we're still seeing a drop or change in pressure at that point. And then this would be number 2. Well, I don't have number 2 injector unplugged. I have number 1 injector unplugged. So it can be kind of confusing, but at this point we can see that we have a weird anomaly in the waveform. Now, some vehicles this test does not work on. Some vehicles you don't have the ability to perform this test. So now that we looked at it with the pulse sensor, let's go ahead and look at it with the WPS500 and see if we see the same type of resolution or image that we're seeing now. So on the WPS, I'm going to go to range 3, which is going to be 5 psi plus or minus. I'm going to try it without the zoom feature first. And since I'm not sure what my scaling is going to be, I'm going to bump it up a little bit until we find out for sure. Now let's go ahead and start up the vehicle again. Oh, I want to plug this injector back in. So we'll just keep in mind that I'm synced up to channel or injector number 3. Okay, we're not seeing a whole lot, so I'm gonna go down to 100 millivolts. And we're still not seeing much. Now, one thing that this pressure transducer does have is a zoom feature. So I'm gonna press the zoom button, press it again, press it again. So now I'm at zoom level 3. So we see a waveform that looks pretty similar to what we were seeing. Sorry, waiting for that power antenna to go down. Waveform that looks pretty similar to what we were seeing with the pulse sensor. It looks slightly different. We have a little more anomalies. If I hooked up to a vehicle and saw this, I would just, and it was running fine, I'd say I can't use this test. This test doesn't have enough accuracy for me to rely on it. So some vehicles you can see it perfectly, some vehicles you can't. So although this test can be useful at times to try and verify if an injector is firing, as we can see here, the results aren't always conclusive. Sometimes it's just a good thing to throw on there, and if you think you have an injector that's not firing, you can't access that injector. You might be able to look at the waveform and be able to identify that, but sometimes the results are inconclusive. So I wouldn't 100% rely on this test. I want to see what you guys come up with. I know there's a lot of people out there that have had really good luck with this test. I use it occasionally, but it's mostly on older vehicles that still have an external regulator. So let me know, do you think that this is a test that we should include in our arsenal of testing, or is it something that's too inconclusive and we should just go on to other testing, like actually hooking up our pressure transducer to our fuel supply and watching that instead, and then maybe toggling the injectors, or just jumping straight into electrically testing the injectors. The only thing with that is we could still have an injector that we have pintle movement, all that stuff looks good, but maybe the injector screen is plugged up and we're not getting that injector flow. And in that case, you might have to do an injector drop test where you actually pressurize the fuel rail with the gauge on it and fire each injector individually and see how much pressure you drop on each one of those injectors. That may be the test that you have to do to prove this out. I personally think that the pulse sensor gave a better image than the absolute pressure sensor. Because we're dealing with such a small amount of change in pressure, the pulse sensor is a little more sensitive to that. Okay, so for the week 14 waveform, hook up a pulse sensor or a pressure transducer to the injector or the fuel rail pressure regulator and see what kind of waveform you get. Some other options, stuff I've seen people build, is they will put a fuel pressure regulator with the return capped off on their pressure tester. So when they check fuel pressure, they also have a diaphragm there that they can hook onto with their pulse sensor. So they're measuring the actual rail pulses instead of the return fuel pulses. So that's an option as well. I don't have a setup like that. I don't use this test enough to justify spending the time to build a test rig like that. But maybe if I found it more useful, I would be more inclined to do that. Let me know what you guys think. Is this something we should include in our testing arsenal, or should we just jump to straight, mechanical testing, injector drop testing, where we put a gauge on there and run each injector, with a tester that runs at so many clicks, and we see how much fuel we drop? That's the best way to check for injector flow, in my opinion. Some of the newer vehicles will do it automatically for you. If it has a rail pressure sensor, it'll run the pump up, it'll fire injector number 1, it'll run the pump up and do injector number 2, and it'll automate the whole thing and give you the results. The newer Fords are really good for doing that. So that's my personal favorite, but if we have to go around that and do testing like this, sometimes this will get you by. Let me know what you think. Post your captures up in the group. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, and maybe some that are a little more useful, subscribe and click the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.